They said every blessing comes with a price, but no one imagined the cost would be revealed on a wedding night. In a small town where everyone knew everyone's secrets, one bride carried something so impossible that even when the truth came out, people still couldn't believe what they were seeing. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, the quiet girl who lived by the river, and the night her new husband discovered she wasn't entirely human. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Mitchell grew up in Riverside, a town of about 3,000 people tucked between farmland and forest in rural Virginia. She was the kind of person you'd pass on the street and barely notice. Average height, brown hair, usually pulled back in a ponytail, clothes that never drew attention. She worked at the local library, lived alone in a small cottage near Willow Creek, and kept to herself in a way that people respected but found slightly odd. Her childhood was marked by one event everyone remembered. When she was 7 years old, she nearly drowned in Willow Creek during a summer church picnic. The current had pulled her under near the old stone bridge, and by the time they pulled her out, she'd been underwater for almost 4 minutes. The paramedics said it was a miracle she survived without brain damage. Her mother, who died 2 years later from cancer, told people that God had spared Sarah for a reason. After that day, Sarah developed a few quirks. She never went swimming again. She avoided walking barefoot outside. She wore long skirts and pants even in the summer heat. And if you looked closely, she always kept her ankles covered. People chalked it up to trauma or modesty, typical for a girl raised by a deeply religious single mother. At 28, Sarah met David Harper at a community fundraiser for the fire department. David was 31, a mechanic who'd taken over his father's auto shop on Main Street after the old man's heart attack. He was straightforward, loyal, the kind of guy who'd help you change a tire in the rain without expecting anything in return. Their relationship developed slowly. Coffee at the diner on Wednesdays, walks around the town square on Sunday afternoons. David's mother, Patricia, liked Sarah immediately because she was polite and didn't put on airs. His younger sister, Emma, thought Sarah was sweet but found her a little too reserved, almost secretive. When David proposed after a year of dating, he did it simply, with his grandmother's ring at the same spot by Willow Creek where they'd had their first real conversation. Sarah said yes, but for just a moment, David noticed her glance at the water with something that looked like fear. He didn't mention it. Everyone has baggage, he thought. 6 months later, they planned a small wedding at the Baptist Church on Elm Street. Reception in the fellowship hall, nothing fancy. The whole town was invited because that's how things worked in Riverside. You didn't leave people out. The week before the wedding, something strange happened that should have been a warning but wasn't recognized as one until much later. Sarah was at the church helping Patricia arrange flowers when Emma came in carrying a box of decorations. As Emma unpacked glass vases, one slipped and shattered on the tile floor. Sarah jumped back so fast she knocked over a chair. When Patricia asked if she was alright, Sarah was staring at the broken glass with an expression Emma later described as like she'd seen a ghost, but also like she was trying to hide it. Sarah apologized, said she'd been startled, and immediately bent down to help clean up, but she was careful, almost methodically so, to avoid stepping anywhere near where the water from the vases had spilled across the floor. Patricia thought it was odd but didn't say anything. That same week, David's uncle Robert, who'd been a traveling preacher before he retired, stopped by the auto shop to talk to David. Robert was in his 70s, a man who claimed to have the sight, though most people thought he was just superstitious. He told David, "I had a dream about your wedding. There was water everywhere and your bride was standing in the middle of it, but she wasn't drowning. She was home." David laughed it off, told his uncle to lay off the late-night television. But Robert gripped his arm and said, "Just promise me something. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you ask her the truth before you judge her. Promise me that." David promised, mostly to get the old man to leave, but the conversation stuck with him. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday in late September, warm with clear skies. Sarah looked beautiful in a simple white dress with lace sleeves that came down to her wrists and a hem that brushed the floor. She wore white flats instead of heels, and when Emma teased her about it, Sarah said heels made her ankles swell. The ceremony went perfectly. Sarah's vows were short but heartfelt. David's voice cracked when he promised to love her in sickness and in health. The reception was everything a small-town wedding should be. Too much food, a DJ playing songs from 3 decades ago, kids running around while their parents danced. Sarah smiled more than David had ever seen her smile. She ate cake, hugged guests, posed for pictures. But there were small moments, if you were paying attention, where something seemed off. When they cut the cake and David playfully tried to smear frosting on her face, Sarah dodged him with reflexes that seemed almost too quick, too fluid. When they danced their first dance and David spun her around, the movements were smooth in a way that didn't quite match someone who told him she had 2 left feet. And twice during the reception, David noticed Sarah staring out the window toward the woods where Willow Creek ran behind the church property. Each time, she looked worried, like she was expecting something. By 9 o'clock, the reception was winding down. David and Sarah planned to spend their wedding night at his house, a small 2-bedroom he'd inherited from his grandfather, about a mile outside town near the edge of the woods. They said their goodbyes, drove off with tin cans rattling behind the truck, and arrived home just as the sun was setting. The house was quiet, filled with the golden light of late evening. David carried Sarah over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down in the living room. They were alone for the first time all day, and the energy between them shifted from celebratory to intimate. David suggested they open the bottle of champagne his sister had left in the fridge. Sarah agreed but asked if she could change out of her dress first. She went into the bedroom while David popped the cork and poured 2 glasses. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. When he called her name and got no answer, he walked to the bedroom door, which was closed. He knocked. Sarah's voice came through, tight and strained. "Just give me a minute." David asked if everything was okay. There was a pause, then Sarah said, "I need to tell you something, but I don't know how." David's stomach dropped. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind. Was she sick? Was there someone else? He opened the door slowly. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her wedding dress, but she'd removed her shoes. Her feet were bare, and she was staring at them with an expression of pure dread. David stepped closer and asked again what was wrong. Sarah looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with tears. She said, "I should have told you before. I wanted to, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane." David sat down next to her and took her hand. He told her that whatever it was, they'd deal with it together. That's what marriage meant. Sarah took a shaky breath and said, "Do you remember when I almost drowned as a kid?" David nodded. Everyone in town knew that story. Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did drown. I was dead for those 4 minutes. But something in the water brought me back, something old. It saved me, but it changed me." David didn't understand. He asked what she meant by changed. Sarah stood up and walked to the window. The bedroom faced the backyard, and beyond the yard was a stretch of woods that led down to Willow Creek. The moon was rising, full and bright, and its light spilled through the window and across the floor. Sarah stepped into that light, and David watched as something impossible happened. The skin on Sarah's feet and ankles began to shimmer. At first, David thought it was a trick of the light, but as he leaned closer, he saw it clearly. Scales. Tiny, delicate scales that caught the moonlight and reflected it back in shades of green and silver. They ran from her toes up to her mid-calf, smooth and seamless, not like a costume or makeup, but like they were part of her. David stood up so fast he knocked over the champagne glass on the nightstand. It shattered on the floor and Sarah flinched at the sound. David stammered, asked what he was looking at. If this was some kind of joke, Sarah shook her head and said it wasn't a joke. She explained that after she drowned, she started changing. It happened slowly at first. Her skin would itch near water. She'd have dreams of swimming in places that didn't exist. By the time she was 12, the scales had fully formed, and she realized they appeared whenever she was near water or under moonlight. Her mother had helped her hide it, taught her to avoid situations where people might see. Long skirts, staying out of pools, never going barefoot. Sarah had learned to live with it, but she'd also learned to be terrified of what people would think if they knew. David stood there, frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. He wasn't a man who believed in the supernatural. He fixed cars, went to church on Sundays, watched football on weekends. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, but here it was. right in front of him, undeniable. He asked Sarah if it hurt, if she was in pain. Sarah said, no, it didn't hurt. It was just part of her now. She said she'd wanted to tell him so many times, but every time she tried, the words wouldn't come. How do you tell someone you love that you're not entirely human? David walked to the window and looked out at the woods. He could hear Willow Creek in the distance, the faint sound of water moving over stones. He thought about his uncle's warning, about the dreams, about all the little moments that hadn't quite added up. Then he thought about Sarah, the woman who'd listened to him talk about his father's death and never once made him feel weak for crying. The woman who'd spent her Saturday mornings volunteering at the animal shelter. The woman who'd promised to stand by him for the rest of her life. He turned back to her and asked, "Does this change who you are?" Sarah looked at him, confused. David repeated the question, "Does this change who you are? Are you still the Sarah I know?" Sarah's tears spilled over, and she nodded. David walked back to her and knelt down in front of her. He looked at her feet, at the scales that shimmered in the moonlight, and then he looked up at her face. He said, "Then we'll figure it out." But figuring it out turned out to be more complicated than either of them anticipated. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find the scales had faded back into normal skin. She explained to David that it only happened under certain conditions, bright moonlight, being near running water, or sometimes when her emotions were heightened. David asked if there was a way to stop it or reverse it. Sarah said she didn't know. She'd spent years researching, reading everything from medical journals to folklore, but she'd never found an explanation that made sense. The closest thing she'd found were old stories about water spirits and river guardians, myths from a dozen different cultures about beings who lived between the human world and something else. David suggested they see a doctor, but Sarah refused. She'd been to doctors as a teenager, and they'd found nothing wrong. One dermatologist had suggested it was a rare skin condition, but the test came back normal. Another doctor had implied she was making it up for attention, which had devastated her. She'd learned that some things couldn't be explained, only accepted. David didn't push, but he also didn't stop thinking about it. He started doing his own research, late at night on his laptop after Sarah had gone to sleep. He found forums where people claimed to have similar experiences, but most of it sounded like conspiracy theories or attention-seeking. Then he found a post from a woman in Oregon who described almost the exact same thing: scales that appeared near water, a near-drowning experience as a child, a sense of being connected to something ancient. The woman had included a name at the bottom of her post, Dr. Elena Cross, a researcher at a university in Seattle who studied folklore and unexplained phenomena. David sent her an email. Dr. Cross responded 3 days later. She said she'd been studying cases like Sarah's for over a decade, and while she couldn't offer a scientific explanation, she believed there was a pattern. She explained that in almost every culture, there were stories of people who were touched by water spirits or elemental beings, and those people were often marked in some way. Sometimes it was a birthmark, sometimes heightened abilities, and sometimes physical changes that defied explanation. She said, most of these people lived normal lives, but they often felt a pull toward water, a sense of belonging to something they couldn't name. She offered to meet with them if they were willing to travel to Seattle. David showed the email to Sarah, and for the first time since the wedding night, he saw hope in her eyes. 2 weeks later, they flew to Seattle. Dr. Cross met them at a small coffee shop near the university. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes, and she greeted Sarah like she was an old friend. They talked for hours. Sarah described everything: the drowning, the changes, the dreams she'd been having since she was a child of swimming in oceans that glowed with light. Dr. Cross listened without judgment, taking notes and asking questions. At the end of the conversation, she told Sarah something that changed everything. She said, "You're not cursed, you're connected. Whatever saved you that day didn't just bring you back to life, it made you part of something older than any of us. You're a bridge between two worlds, and that's not something to fear, that's something extraordinary." Sarah cried when she heard that. For the first time in her life, someone had told her she wasn't broken or strange. She was extraordinary. Dr. Cross gave them resources, books to read, people to contact, and she told them to reach out anytime. On the flight home, Sarah held David's hand and said, "Thank you for not running." David squeezed her hand and said, "I married you for better or worse. This is just part of the package." When they got back to Riverside, They decided to tell Patricia and Emma the truth. They sat them down in the living room and explained everything. Patricia's first reaction was disbelief, then shock, then worry. She asked if Sarah was safe, if there was any danger. David explained what Dr. Cross had said, and slowly Patricia began to accept it. Emma, on the other hand, was fascinated. She asked 100 questions, wanted to see the scales, wanted to know if Sarah had any special abilities. Sarah laughed and said she wished, but as far as she knew, the scales were the only visible change. Emma made Sarah promise to tell her if anything else happened. Over the next few months, life settled into a new kind of normal. Sarah still worked at the library. David still ran the auto shop. They went to church, had dinner with family, did all the regular things couples do. But there were also new routines. On nights when the moon was full, Sarah would go down to Willow Creek and sit by the water. David would go with her sometimes, and they'd sit in silence while the scales shimmered on her skin. Sarah said it felt like coming home, like the water was welcoming her back. David didn't fully understand it, but he didn't need to. He just needed to be there. One evening in early spring, about 6 months after the wedding, Sarah came home from work looking pale. David asked what was wrong, and she said she'd been feeling strange all day, dizzy, nauseous, emotional. David's first thought was that maybe she was sick, but then Sarah said, "I took a test at lunch. I'm pregnant." David's world stopped. They talked about kids, but it had always been a someday conversation, not a now conversation. He asked if she was sure, and Sarah nodded. She was terrified, not just of being a mother, but of what this meant. Would the baby be like her? Would there be complications? Would doctors even be able to help if something went wrong? David called Dr. Cross, and she agreed to consult with Sarah's obstetrician remotely. The pregnancy was monitored closely, but to everyone's surprise, it progressed normally. Sarah's doctor, who didn't know about the scales, said everything looked healthy. Sarah's scales still appeared near water, but they didn't seem to affect the baby. 8 months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Grace, after Sarah's mother. When the nurse handed Grace to Sarah for the first time, Sarah unwrapped the blanket and checked her daughter's feet with her heart in her throat. They were normal, tiny, perfect human feet. No scales, no marks. Sarah cried with relief, and David held them both. Grace was just a regular, beautiful baby. As Grace grew, Sarah watched her carefully for any signs of change, but there were none. Grace learned to walk, to talk, to laugh, and she showed no connection to water beyond the normal love every kid has for splashing in puddles. By the time Grace was 3, Sarah had started to relax. Maybe the connection skipped a generation. Maybe it was just her. She was okay with that. Life in Riverside continued. David expanded the auto shop. Sarah got promoted to head librarian. Grace started preschool and made friends easily. To the outside world, they were just another family. But Sarah never forgot what she was. On quiet nights, she'd still go down to the creek and let the moonlight touch her skin. David would watch from the porch, and Grace, too young to understand, would ask why Mama liked the water so much. David would say, because it makes her happy, and that was true enough. One evening, when Grace was 4, she asked Sarah why she never went swimming. Sarah knelt down and said, "I almost drowned once when I was little, and it scared me." Grace thought about this, then said, "But the water saved you, right? So you don't have to be scared." Sarah stared at her daughter, stunned. She'd never told Grace the full story. She asked how Grace knew that, and Grace shrugged and said, "I don't know, I just do." Sarah felt a chill, but also a strange sense of peace. Maybe Grace didn't have skills, but maybe she had something else. Maybe she had understanding. Years passed. Grace grew into a bright, curious child who loved books and animals and asked too many questions. David's mother passed away peacefully at 78, and Emma moved to Richmond for a job but visited often. Sarah continued to live her quiet life, marked by water and moonlight, and slowly, the fear she'd carried for so long began to fade. She realized that what Dr. Cross had said was true. She wasn't cursed, she was connected. And that connection, however strange, had given her something precious. A second chance at life, a loving husband, and a daughter who saw the world with wonder. One night, when Grace was 7, the same age Sarah had been when she drowned, they went to Willow Creek together. It was summer, and the fireflies were out, flickering like tiny stars. Grace asked if she could put her feet in the water, and Sarah hesitated, then said yes. They sat on the bank, and Grace dangled her toes in the current, laughing at how cold it was. Sarah watched her. And for a moment, she felt the presence of something in the water, not threatening, not dangerous, just there, watching, protecting. She didn't know if it was the same thing that had saved her, but she felt grateful. Grace looked up and said, "Mama, the water feels nice, like it's saying hello." Sarah smiled and said, "Maybe it is." So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you discovered that someone you loved was hiding something impossible, something that defied everything you thought you knew about the world, would you walk away or would you choose to understand? And if you were Sarah carrying a secret that could change how everyone saw you, would you have had the courage to tell the truth, knowing you might lose everything? This story is about more than just scales or water or mysteries. It's about the things we hide because we're afraid of being rejected, and it's about the people who love us enough to stay when the truth finally comes out. Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the things that make us different, the things we're most ashamed of, are also the things that make us extraordinary. And sometimes love isn't about understanding everything. It's about choosing someone even when you don't. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about the secrets you carry or the people you love, let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were David? What would you have done if you were Sarah? And if you've ever felt like you were hiding part of yourself from the world, know that you're not alone. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want more stories that make you think and feel. And remember, we're all a little bit extraordinary, even if the world doesn't always see it.